Hello and welcome to the Ladies at UX Atlanta August 2022 event. Doing a mapping workshop, going to cover a bunch of different UX maps. As we get started, I'll let you know that the agenda for today is I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to talk a bit about maps. I'm going to talk about maps generally speaking, which will lead into talking about mapping, and that I'm going to talk about specifically in UX context. And I'll be sure to leave some time for questions at the end. As we're talking, I do have a couple of activities that we're going to be doing. So if you want to participate, please have something to sketch with handy. And also, I am going to be giving out a lot of references as we go. I will send you a link to a reference list at the end of the talk. You don't have to keep track of all of the references as you go. So take notes as you like or don't like, but please be sure to leave questions at the end. And catnap map is right. This is my cat, Lucinda. And the mapped index cards she's sitting on will also come back later in this presentation. Okay, so I'm Candra. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I entered UX as a graduate from an iSchool. I went to the University of Michigan School of Information, from which I graduated 10 years ago. So this marks my 10th year in the field. My current title is Principal UX Architect, where I work for Cox Automotive Incorporated. I'm also an adjunct instructor with the Brandeis University Graduate Professional Studies Program in User-Centered Design. I'm not here officially representing any of my employers right now. I will be on my best behavior, of course, but this is not an official presentation for either of them. Just want to make that clear. And to the person who loves the illustration, that is our friend Havana, who is incredible. And yeah, really appreciate it. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to get into UX mapping, but I'm going to start with some maps. And the first map I'm going to start with is a pretty famous and influential one. This is Christopher Tolkien's map of Middle-earth. It is the map that was included with the earliest editions of his father's very famous Lord of the Rings. And if anybody is a fantasy, epic fantasy reader, they'll be familiar with the practice of including a map with in the front of the books, often that illustrates the world in which a fantasy takes place. And that map helps create meaning and situate that world. So people who read these novels, and somebody in the chat mentioned Game of Thrones doing this. Is true. This is very true. Like one of my favorite things in the world actually is the Game of Thrones opening sequence that uses a map to show where different events are taking place in each episode. And the A Song of Ice and Fire books practice having maps in their books as well. But what these do is they create meaning and assist with wayfinding for the readers of these books. So, you know, you get a sense of where the different events take place. You get a sense of how far apart people are. You get a sense of how much time it might take to travel from one place to another. So these are an important convention that speak to overall purposes of maps in general. But there's also a really kind of cool thing in terms of different ways of communicating different information. So a friend of mine a long time ago sent me a t-shirt that had this subway map on it. And this is Regan Lee's There and Back Again. This is a map of Middle-earth re-envisioned as a subway map. Now, obviously there's no subways in Middle-earth. Maybe there are now, who knows? But it does a pretty cool job of duplicating a lot of the distances and spatial relationships, the way that different places in Middle-earth are located in relation to each other. And I always thought this was kind of cool because it shows that one of the cool things about maps is that you can represent them in different ways. They can represent information in different ways, which speaks to one of the main things that maps do. Maps communicate information. So this map is a screenshot that I took in March of 2020 in the first week after my then employer had sent us home to work from home because of the pandemic. And one of the things that struck me, the reason why I took the screenshot and I posted it on my work chat is because this is a map of Atlanta nearing rush hour, and the traffic is almost completely green. So if you're in Atlanta and you know about Atlanta traffic, the idea of being close to rush hour and having almost no orange or red on a highway map of Atlanta was almost unheard of. And that's one of the things that really drove home to me the enormity of, you know, folks staying from home, staying at home and working at home because of the pandemic. So this is a visual communication of some information. It's not just the location and where these different parts of Atlanta are in relation to each other and where the highways are, highway numbers are, but it's also, it showed in real time, a real change in a condition here. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is visual communication, but I also wanted to point out that when we use things like Google Maps, we're not always limited to visual communication. So if you allow your driving instructions to read to you, for example, then you might also see, you might also hear your instructions. And this speaks to all of our mapping activities as well. When we think about designing inclusively, even though we're primarily making visual artifacts, there are things we'll need to consider beyond the visual, and I'll come back to that as well. Another really important part about maps is that they're abstractions. There's a very famous story by Jorge Luis Borges called Del Rigor en la Ciencia, which is usually translated in English as On Exactitude in Science. And it's literally just this paragraph. So it is a one paragraph story. And it's the takeaway from the story. It's a beautiful story. And I'll read a bit of it. In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire, the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the Cartographers Guild struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, and which coincided point for point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that that vast map was useless. And not without some pitilessness was it that they delivered it up to the inclemencies of sun and winters. In the desert of the West, still today, there are tattered ruins of that map, inhabited by animals and beggars. In all the land, there is no other relic of the disciplines of geography. So it's short enough, I went ahead and read the whole thing. And then it's attributed to Suarez Miranda. This is what's called, it's a kind of story that is a literary forgery, implying that the book that it came from is real, when really it's a piece of fiction. So the point of this, however, is you have this map, like these map makers kept making these maps that were bigger and bigger and bigger. So the map of a city, the map of a state would take up a whole city. The map of a city would take up a whole town, that kind of thing, to the point where the entire country, the map of the country was the size of the country and was therefore useless. And one of many takeaways from this story is that you have to have abstraction in maps. You cannot make a map the size of a country. There's a famous saying, the map is not the territory, by Alfred Korbisky. And that's what that point is, that you have to have a level of abstraction with maps. Maps are also tools, and this speaks to, the abstraction speaks to the tools. So my brother recently visited me and I introduced him to the game Hollow Knight, and I made him stop playing for a second so I could take a picture of this. As part of the game, you have to, you collect different location information, which is pretty common in video games. So your character meets this other character who tells the character a map can be a useful thing, but it alone won't show you where you are. If you're not the head for directions, I suggest purchasing a compass for my wife, Iselda. What I love about this is it shows that maps are something that you use in concert with other things. In user experience and information architecture terms, they can help with wayfinding and meaning making, but you're using them in a larger context. You're not using them on their own. And to think about larger contexts in terms of maps, these are some pictures I took on a walk, and you can, in these pictures, there are some really important details. So there are things like markers of where people are. So this is a marker telling people that they, if they want to go to 285, to turn left. There's a marker telling people that a traffic light is coming up. There's a marker for people who are walking on a trail, because this is a paved road, but it's also part of a trail system, that if they were in trouble and needed to share their location with rescue workers, this will tell the rescue workers where they are. This is also a crosswalk. There are markers of a crosswalk here, so the painted sign, but there's also, not everybody can see that sign. So there's the textured plate here that if somebody is walking and can't see that they've entered a crosswalk, they can feel the texture of the plate to let them know that they're coming to the end of a sidewalk and a road is coming. There's the button to press to cross the road. And a lot of these buttons will also have a audible component in addition to the visual component. So for example, when you press this button, a sound will play that will let you know when that the button's been pushed and when it's safe to walk. So these are all indicators of and markers of meaning that get used in conjunction with maps to allow for wayfinding. And the metaphor for UX and information architecture is that the artifacts that we create in terms of maps are used in conjunction with other things, and we need to design them inclusively so that people can process our maps and can also, if they can't see the maps, can still access the information. And this speaks to maps being the result of a process. So in the lead up to creating this talk, I came across a recently published novel called The Cartographers by Punk Shepherd. And the author's note, in it she writes, "We tend to think of maps as perfectly accurate. After all, that's the point of them. What good would a map that lied be? But in fact, many maps do just that. Unbeknownst to almost everyone who unfolds one and trusts it to take them to where they want to go, there's a long-standing secret practice among cartographers of hiding intentional errors, phantom settlements, in their works. Most of the time, these intentional errors are so small and well disguised that they're never found. But every once in a while, a phantom settlement doesn't stay a phantom. Sometimes something magical happens. The Cartographers is a work of fiction, but its inspiration is rooted in truth. This story is for anyone who's ever opened up a map and gotten lost in it." So I included this for two reasons. One, reading that, I instantly was like, I have to read this novel. And two, it's a really good illustration of the fact that people make maps. These are a process. There's an intentionality to it. So the phantom settlements speak to that process. Like there's tradition, there's convention, and then there's meaning and misdirection. Actually, and I was talking to somebody who told me that the reason for the phantom settlements is actually to help detect and avoid forgery. And who knows, maybe that comes up in the novel. I have not gotten to that point yet. I've only read the first 2 chapters, but I just really wanted to bring up the idea that this illustrates, which is that maps are intentional artifacts that people create. And with that, we're going to start talking about mapping. We're going to we've done the setup, and now let's talk the UX stuff. Okay, I'm going to talk about some UX mapping processes. We'll do some quick versions of some, but some of these are just going to be informational, and I'm going to point you in directions to finding out more about them. So the first, and we're going to contextualize these in terms of what kinds of map you can do for what kinds of activities. So the first kind we're going to talk about is mapping, how mapping can help you think something through. And the map technique that can help you think something through that I'm going to share with you is a concept called mind maps. I first actually encountered these as a child in elementary school in a creative writing context. What you're seeing here is a mind map that I made for this talk. It's a very common technique and it gets used in a lot of contexts. But I really like it for even what we do in terms of working on our projects. And so some of the things to call out, like you can see there's a whole section of what we just talked about in terms of fantasy maps and Hollow Knight and Borges and all those other things. But there are things that I didn't bring up, like there's a really cool subgenre of crafts and maps that if I actually started talking about that, we'd probably talk about that all night. So it's probably good that I left it off. But it's a indicator that this is something that gets your ideas out, but you don't have to use everything in your mind maps. And with that in mind, here's our first activity. Let's make a mind map. Okay, so hopefully you have some sketching tools. You can also do this online if you have access to a whiteboard. There's all kinds of ways to do it. Also, if drawing is not a thing that you can do, and I'm not talking about in terms of drawing beautifully or not, I'm talking about if you can draw physically or not. Another way to do this could be to make a list, to make a series of lists instead of drawing branches. But the way to make a mind map, you start with a big circle in the center and you give it a name, and then you work off branches as you have different ideas that are triggered by your original focus. I'm suggesting that you do a mind map of your typical week, but you can do a mind map of anything that's on your mind. So we're going to take 5 minutes. If you decide to do the mind map of what your week entails, you can think about things like work, your care responsibilities, both for yourself and for others, any hobbies you might have, and anything else. Branch those off from your main circle. Keep making branches and see what comes up. Okay, does this make sense to folks? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and give us 5 minutes then, starting now. Okay, there's a question in chat about what we're mind mapping. So we are, I'm suggesting you mind map your typical week, but you can map whatever you want. If you choose to do the typical week, think about what your week entails, work, care responsibilities, etc., and just practice making a mind map. And we have about 3 minutes left. It's just a quick one. Okay, we're at the 30-second mark, so wrap up what you're working on. Okay. So how was that? Anybody have any thoughts? How somebody planned the weekend and is overwhelmed? Well, hopefully one of the benefits of mapping can also be to help process things and you can get a little less overwhelmed. But yeah, I see it was fun for some folks. What else? Any other thoughts? Oh, yay. Ying's head feels lighter. So yeah, mind maps are great. If you're working on a creative project, they can be a good way to get started, especially if you're stuck. You can use them to process things. They're just a really helpful tool. And somebody mentioned that it was hard to start, but then it got flowing. I experienced that a lot. When I was younger, when I was a kid in elementary school, I used to love them. It's like, oh, I remember going home to my mom, like, we learned how to do this thing called webbing today. As I got older, sometimes it was harder to start. And so, you know, that's okay too, but this can also be a tool that can break you out of that hard to stop, hard to get started situation, and can be a good tool for that. Okay, another thing that mapping can do is it can help you gather information. So I'm going to start out with something called physical modeling. And this is a screenshot from a wonderful cartoon called City of Ghosts. And City of Ghosts, the showrunner is called, her name is Elizabeth Ito. And she's worked on shows like Adventure Time, for example. And in this first episode, so the premise of the show is that there are a group of kids. They have a ghost club. And this is more Casper the Friendly Ghost than any kind of child inappropriate ghost. And so what they do is they all live in Los Angeles, and they interview neighborhood ghosts to find out about Los Angeles history. And in this first episode, there's a ghost that seems to be haunting a restaurant that is about to open. And one of the things that the ghost does is it moves a Maneke Neko statue around, those Lucky Cat statues you sometimes see in restaurants. And so what these kids have done is they've drawn a map of the restaurant, and they've put a Maneke Neko sticker everywhere the statue had been moved to. So they mapped out the locations of where the statue had been. And I'm watching this and I'm laughing because there's a technique in Karen Holtzblatt's rapid contextual design called physical modeling, where when you are doing observational research, you make a map of the area you're observing, and you map out different happenings in that area. So if you're, for example, observing somebody doing their job, you see where they go and you map out where they go, how long they stand in certain places. Are there any barriers? Like, so for example, if let's say that you were observing a restaurant, you might, and that was open, and people were running into each other when doing their tasks. That would be the kind of barrier you want to note in your physical model. And you don't have to be a great artist to do these. They should be sketch level, but you can collect a lot of really important information with this. And so I was having a great time watching this cartoon because it was a fantastic example of physical modeling. And this first episode, I'm going to tell you, they have a lot of really good UX research techniques in this first episode, including some pretty good interviewing. But I just wanted to show this as an example of a kind of model you can make from observing. And that's a kind of information gathering. Another kind of information gathering is what I asked everyone to do at the beginning as they were coming in. So I asked people to place sticky notes to illustrate where they were coming in from. And it cracks me up a little bit because you can't give people sticky notes without them changing the colors. So one of the issues here, and this is a good thing actually, because when the colors are changed, you can see them better on top of each other. It's actually really hard to find a high contrast color with maps, and I should have made these maps black and white. Because what you've created here, what we've created as a group, is a heat map. So we now know that most of the people who joined us from the US are in Atlanta. That's not surprising, given that we are ladies at UX Atlanta. We have several folks in Seattle, a lot of folks on the East Coast, some Midwestern folks, and throughout the country. And while we know that most of the folks are joining us from the US, we also see that we've got some folks from Brazil. Hello. And then we also have folks from various places in Asia, from Europe, and from Australia. This is really cool. And the really funny thing about this is my friend texted me about this meetup. He asked me if it was okay if he came. And I was like, how did you even know about this? And he let me know that it was on UX message board he's on. But that gave me the idea for this, which was to have folks map this out. But the takeaway here is we've just made a heat map. We can easily get some information about where folks are coming from. And it gives us it's a quick, easy way to get some interesting information about what we're doing. So some other mapping formats for information gathering that can be very helpful are empathy mapping, which is a way of processing. It can be a way to process things like user interviews and other user research, where you map out what the information that you've gotten, and you do some affinity grouping to see if any themes are emerging. We just talked about heat maps and physical modeling. And I also want to shout out Sophia Prater's object-oriented UX object mapping, which is mapping all of the objects in your system when you're doing design work for it. This is a really important kind of information gathering you can do. Sophia, I will be providing I'll be providing a document with information about where to find more about these kinds of maps, including an article that Sophia wrote about object-oriented UX that includes object mapping how-tos. And she also does trainings on this. But I just wanted to point these out as that same document will have all of these listed. But I wanted to point out that these are all very good techniques specifically for gathering information. The next thing we're going to talk about is mapping as an alignment tool. And we'll do a little detour first, because I'm going to talk a little bit about a specific kind of process mapping and give you an example of that. But what I mean by mapping can be an alignment tool is none of us work in a vacuum. Even if you are the only UX practitioner on your team, you're going to be working with your stakeholders. Ideally, you're working with the people who will be using your software in various capacities. So one of the things that's very important as you're doing design work is aligning on that. This could be aligning on a number of things, aligning on the information that we have, aligning on what we're actually trying to build, aligning on what our problems are. And so that's a really important part of our process generally. I see there's a question in the chat, how does object-oriented UX relate to object-oriented programming? It's related. So basically, in the article I'm going to send to you, Sophia talks a lot about how mapping objects is part of programming, and that we should bring it into design before we start designing, is the short version of it. But the article that's in the PDF that I'm going to give you will answer a lot of those questions. So as we think about mapping for alignment, I'm going to use an example. One of the things I mentioned when we were doing the social aspect, social time of this presentation is the idea of keeping track. We were talking about there was a problem with Zoom and the Zoom chat, and I mentioned that it's a good idea to keep track of when you see instances of bad design. Start keeping a record of that. It helps you think as a designer, and you can think about ways to improve those processes. Well, one of my big pet peeves is payment for parking machines. They're also bad. I actually was, there was a situation once where there was folks who were trying to figure out how to pay for their parking, and I helped them. And unfortunately, the whole time I gave them this very unsolicited lecture about how it's not their fault. It's the machine. It's poorly designed. They're not doing anything wrong. And they just wanted to pay for their parking. But this is one of my big issues. So these are the ones at Ponce City Market and in various places around Atlanta. And in looking at this, my questions would be, what's the happy path? So what I mean by that is if the machine is working properly and people are using the machine as intended and everything's going smoothly, what is that path? But I'd also ask, what can go wrong? And how would you show both the happy path and what can go wrong in a chart? So I did a little chart of what I would consider to be the happy path from having used these machines. And that is, folks would arrive at the parking meter, they would enter their license plate number, they would enter the amount of time they want to pay to park, they would make a decision whether to use a credit card or cash to pay, and they would decide if they wanted a receipt or not. And then once the payment had been made, they'd be done, and yay, they can enjoy having paid for their parking. With this is probably what's considered the happy path for this device. This is what the people who made this device expect to happen. This is what they want to happen. What that chart doesn't do is talk about some of the issues that I have personally seen come up with these machines. For example, the big one, the one that really annoys me about this machine is what happens if somebody doesn't know their plate number. And what happens is that person turns around. If they're in a group, they go, oh, do you know the plate number? If they're by themselves or they're not in a group, or nobody knows the plate number, they go back to their car. They might take a picture of their plate number. They come back, they got to get back in line if it's a busy day. It's a design flaw from the get-go. Then you have to think about, if you're looking at this from the point of view of aligning on a process, how much do you need to document? So this goes back to that Borges story, right? Like how granular do we need to get? Do we need to document which controls are used for each process? Because these controls, there's hardware buttons, 2 sets of buttons here. There's the credit card reader. There's the cash, the thing that takes the cash. There's the thing that gives you a receipt. And there's a lot of buttons here. So how do we need to include that in this process or not? And there's reasons to include them and there's reasons to not include them. It really depends on what your intent for this diagram would be. And then what do you do about things that can go wrong? And the reason why I bring that up is because, so for example, a lot of what I'm tasked with doing at my current job is thinking about ways to optimize our system. But a lot of our documentation is all very happy path. So how do we optimize the system if we don't document what goes wrong? So one of the things that I like to incorporate into flows is what happens when things are going to go wrong. So for example, what would happen if the connection to the payments process goes down? What would happen if the printer is out of paper? What would happen if the machine rejects their bills? Like, I know a lot of people don't use cash anymore, but most folks remember trying to feed in $1 to the dollar machine and having it not work. So what are the things to document in terms of the process, in terms of how it doesn't work? Sometimes this is really important to documenting a process, as important as documenting the happy path. So with that in mind, let's practice mapping a process. So I want you to grab that mind map you made, choose something on that mind map, and sketch out how you would depict it. Now you can do a flow chart, you could do a list, you can do however you want to do it. And if sketching isn't something that's appropriate for you, you can type up a list. But what you're doing right now is you're thinking of various steps. So once you've chosen a process from your mind map, think about what steps you need to include. Think about where there are decision points to consider, excuse me, and think about if there are any potential barriers to look out for. If so, how would you depict them? And so what I have over here are some basic flowchart shapes. You can use these or not, but traditionally a rectangle is going to be a process. A diamond is going to be a decision point. This weird shape with a slightly angled top indicates a manual input. And this kind of capsule shape is the end of a process. So I'd like you to go ahead and work on that process map and use it any format you'd like. And we are going to take about 10 minutes to do that. Before we get started, are there any questions? Okay, starting the timer for 10 minutes and go ahead and work on your process map. Of course, I'm going to, I'll minimize the timer so that we can see both the timer and the instructions. Looking to see if there's a way I can make the timer smaller. It's so small I can make it. Okay, so I'll bring the timer back periodically, but I'll leave the instructions up. Okay, we're past 5-minute mark. There's a there's a question in the chat about Shazam's shapes. um, there was a example of depicting potential problems with a Shazam's shape, which is actually, interestingly enough, like a bolt of lightning is how barriers are often depicted in Karen Holtzblatt's stuff. So the way I read it was a Shazam shape might be like a shape like a bolt of lightning. So you can see that it's an issue, but also be kind of excited by it because it's an opportunity. As let's see, Kim, I hope your name is Kim, said, with all the excitement that comes from the unexpected. That's a great way to look at it, because the whole point of depicting barriers is they are design opportunities. Yep. The really funny thing is I almost used a shape like that for the barriers on the parking example, but I got too caught up in the shapes and I had to let it go. I was spending too much time thinking about. Okay, down to a minute. Okay, time's up. How was that? Things so fun. I saw a little bit earlier that it was harder than some folks expected. And yes, especially when you start getting into complex processes, they're hard. I see somebody hit a roadblock. Somebody hit flow state. I see difficult. These are all legitimate responses. And that speaks to the importance of practicing. So one of the things to get good at this is, we can map these out for in our work contexts, but also think about doing it for just, so like, taking pictures of parking meters, how would you map that? Thinking about the various processes that you encounter every day and how you would depict them, even something as simple as, say, brushing your teeth. Have you thought about how complex it can be to brush your teeth? So these are things to think through as to practice as you're mapping out your processes. Okay, so I depicted these under mapping for alignment because often, so for example, I've recently been tasked with doing a similar map for a very complex process. And a big part of it has been engaging other stakeholders in the process to see if we're aligned on what this process is. I've also done some interviews with my coworkers who are responsible for different subsections of the process to, one, get their input on that process, and two, to make sure that I'm understanding it. So it's a good way to get all kinds of alignment. Some other good mapping exercises for alignment can be content models, which is taking all of the different kinds of content in your system and modeling their relationship with each other. User journey maps are a very common alignment tool. And another thing to think back on with that parking example, that parking device is a very small part of somebody's user journey. One of the things that one of the traps we fall into as UX professionals is the product that we work on is often the most important thing in terms of our work, but it's often a very small part of the people we're making it for their experience. So think about parking. Think about how paying for parking is such a small part of what the actual, deciding to go shopping, parking, getting out of the car, deciding what shops you want to go to, or if you're going out to eat, something like that. Paying for parking is a very, very small part of that experience. And mapping the whole experience is a part of really understanding how people use your software and products. So journey maps are really important for alignment and for remembering that what we do is only a small part of the larger part of what people are trying to accomplish. Mental models are another great alignment tool, making sure that the way we understand the people who are using our products, how they're thinking about how they are completing their tasks and what they want to do, aligning that we are all thinking about it and have the similar understanding of it. By we, I mean the stakeholders who are making the products. We just worked on a process flow. Another amazing flow that I was actually only very recently gotten a chance to do is making service blueprints, which has the benefit of thinking about flows from the point of view of all of the different components of what go into delivering a service. So like, if you think about it in terms of software, like the back end, different, if you're doing a product that is used by like a software as a service thing, for example, what your product does versus what the people who pay to use your product is doing versus what they are using for, say, their customers. All of these things are important to understand how they relate to each other, and a service blueprint is a fantastic way to do that. And then stakeholder maps. I talk about stakeholders a lot, making sure that you have the right people in the room and understanding what's going on for your process, mapping out your stakeholders and where they are in the process, both in terms of decision-making and in terms of using your products, especially if you work in enterprise software, can be a really, really, really helpful activity to do. Okay, so another really important thing about mapping is it's a form of documentation. Like mapping, maybe not, but maps are a form of documentation. And so a lot of what you're doing with them is creating things to either record some decisions and or to share out. So every single thing we've just talked about can be a form of share out and documentation. Some additional documentation forms are jobs to be done, jobs atlases, which are a great way to report out jobs to be done research. And then sitemaps. I know I didn't talk much about sitemaps, in part because there's a lot out there about them, but they are one of the fundamentals of information architecture in terms of depicting the structure of a site, app, or other artifact. And they're very, very helpful. And you can create them, excuse me. Realizing I haven't talked this much in a while. They're very helpful for recording information about the structure of something that you're working on. And they're also important alignment tools as well. So any of the mapping techniques we've talked about can also work for documentation and share out. So, okay, I see some questions and I'm going to come back to your questions. Hold on just a moment. Okay, actually, heard of jobs to be done, but what's a job atlas? So a job atlas is a way of depicting, so if you do jobs to be done research, and that is a way of thinking of UX in terms of what people are trying to accomplish. And what people are trying to accomplish can often be complex. Like there's multiple things that people are trying to accomplish. And a jobs atlas records that in a way that you can reference as a designer in terms of whether or not you're helping people accomplish those goals. So let's go back to that parking meter example. Some jobs that parking meter are helping people accomplish is going shopping. Again, paying for parking isn't what people want to do. They want to go shopping. Thinking about the people who are collecting the money from those machines, making money is one of the jobs that people want to do. So like you can think about different jobs that artifact helps people do, and then create a document of all those different jobs. And then how do you set the context for sharing these artifacts more broadly? A lot of that goes back to the good old-fashioned UX evangelism. Like sometimes you might even have to create one of these documents and share it out in a meeting, say, hey, we've been talking about XYZ. I think this is a good way of thinking this through. You might want to create a meeting. You might want to create a workshop where people do some of these together, especially the ones that I specifically called out as good alignment tools. One of the ways you can achieve that alignment is doing a workshop to build those together with various stakeholder groups. But a lot of times it's a matter of you setting that context, even if it's a matter of introducing a new map of the process. And as I mentioned, like there have been places where I've frankly not been allowed to do them. It's like it's been I've had mapping shot down as taking up too much time, and we've got to move faster than that. And I've had mapping be an expectation. Where I work right now, all of the work that we deliver, it's generally expected that we do it with at least a minor process flow. So some of that, it depends on your work situation, and some of that depends on how much you are comfortable with setting up new ways of thinking about things and sharing those out. Great question. Okay, so I mentioned that I was going to briefly discuss different kinds of mapping and then give you some tools for where to learn more. I will send you a PDF with these links, but I really want to point out this article by Jessica Ivins that I love. It is titled "To Learn a New UX Skill, Read an Old Book," and I have a lot of the books in this picture. The reason why I love this article is because a lot of the fundamentals of how to do these things are in some of these old books. So for example, that Rapid Contextual Design book is, I believe, from the 90s or the early 2000s. It is still a profoundly helpful book with really good techniques. A lot of times, unfortunately, because we work in an industry where things are, we want to be seen as innovative, we want to move fast. So if you're looking at web books from 20 years ago, people feel like it's hopelessly outdated. But a lot of the context and a lot of the fundamentals are still worth looking at and can be applied to contemporary software and other development. So with that in mind, I'm going to give you some ideas. And again, I have these all written down or links to them. So my all-time favorite book on design documentation is Communicating Design, 2nd edition by Dan M. Brown. Not the Dan Brown of the Da Vinci Code, but the very famous IA, Dan Brown. This book is from 2011, I believe. And I've actually assigned it in the past, and people have complained about all the examples are old, but you will not find a better book on how to flowchart and how to do site maps, on how to do a lot of these design documentation artifacts that we've discussed today and more. And the ones that have developed after this time, you can still use a lot of his suggestions in terms of learning good things about diagrams and structure from this book. So I highly recommend it. The Nielsen Norman Group is fantastic about providing really good articles with actionable specific advice on how to do things. So I really love them. So for example, when it was suggested that I make a service blueprint, I ended up starting, I Googled service blueprints, and then I found some really great articles from Nielsen Norman. The other thing that I really love about what they do is they're really good at primary sources. So their article on service blueprints led to an article on service design, which led to an article that cited Lynn Shostak as the person who created service design in 1982, and then cited her Harvard Business Review article about it. And I was able to go track down that Harvard Business Review article, which is something I strongly recommend doing. Don't be afraid of primary sources, and don't be afraid to travel that line back to find out how things came about, because none of this stuff comes in a vacuum. A List Apart is another fantastic resource for very practical articles on how to do something. There's tons of places out there, but the Nielsen Norman and List Apart are pretty great in terms of specific instructions on how to do some of these things. As I was putting this talk together, Abby Covert released a print-on-demand book called Stuck Diagrams Help. And this is fantastic. It's a book on how to make different kinds of diagrams and different things to think about as you're diagramming. And then, excuse me, one more reference that I wanted to specifically call out here was this Universal Design Center from CSUN, which specifically has information on accessible infographic design, because again, diagrams are primarily visual, but we need to do our due diligence to make sure that people who can't access them visually can still access our information. And then we also need to make sure that our visual representation is inclusive. So that means things like proper contrasts and not depicting state changes exclusively with color, things like that. And so there's a lot of good resources on this site for doing that. And so one thing I also wanted to do, we talked a lot about UX mapping. We talked a lot about maps as a concept. I also want to remind folks that mapping can be fun. So as my cat was sitting on a doodle map that I made called a Mioriyama. And these are a randomized way of making a map. So, or a landscape. They tend to be landscapes, but I did these kind of weird paths. And what they do is you have these connecting points so that no matter how you shuffle these cards, they always make a continuous path. And it's a lot of fun. If we had been able to meet in person, I would have closed with us making Mioriyama cards and then putting a big one together as a group. But one of the things I really like about this is that, you know, I firmly believe that as design professionals, we should always be exploring the creative and fun aspects of what we do. So some of the references that I'm going to include on the reference list are going to be different kinds of creative maps you can make, different kinds of artistic maps, different kinds of journaling maps. So there's some books on how to do that kind of thing. And, you know, as is often the case, Google Creative Mapping, you can find some pretty cool stuff that way. Okay. So thank you so much for your time and your attention. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm CK Gill. I'm about to add that resource list I keep teasing to the chat. I want to thank ladies at UX Atlanta, and I want to open up, after I get the link to the resource list into the chat, I want to open up for any questions.